I pray that I might speak to you this morning in the name of God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. So Jesus said that if the world hates you, be aware that it hated me. In other words, what I think Jesus is trying to get at is that if you are ticking people off, or if you are challenging the status quo in your own efforts to follow and be faithful to the way of Jesus, then you're probably doing something right. Because the way of Jesus and the way of the world, they're not always the same thing. Now, the way of Jesus, quoting the prophet Isaiah, the way of Jesus is to bring good news to the poor. The way of Jesus is to proclaim release to captives, recovery of sight to the blind. To proclaim the way of Jesus is to let anyone who is feeling and living in an oppressed way, to let them go free. To proclaim the way of Jesus is to proclaim the good news of the gospel to absolutely anyone. All throughout his life, Jesus was absolutely committed to feeding the hungry, curing the sick, welcoming the stranger, forgiving sinners, touching lepers, comforting anyone who found themselves mourning. And above all, throughout his life, Jesus was absolutely 100% committed to bringing hope to those who were feeling full of despair and feeling lost in their lives. As for the way of the world, John in today's gospel, he's using that word, the world, he's using that to refer to any person or any structure or any system of society that is opposed to, that objects to, or that stands in the way of love and dignity being available and offered to all people. A love that is made known in Jesus. And sadly, there were many in Jesus' day, and sadly there are many in our own day, who stand in opposition to Jesus, who stand in opposition to the gospel, who stand in opposition to the way of love and dignity for all. Because the way of love and dignity for all, it demands changes in how people live their lives. The way of love and dignity for all, it requires people who accept that way to be willing to regard others differently than the way that society regards people so often. And it requires sacrifices to be made in our own standard of living in order to make it possible to show radical generosity and compassion to those in need in a meaningful way. And it also calls for a reinterpretation of what our religious institutions are actually there for. Our religious institutions, our churches, they exist to show people that they are worthy of God's love, rather than to beat them down by telling them what horrible sinners they are. Our churches exist to draw people into a relationship with a God who loves them beyond measure, rather than to shut them out or to try to exclude them because they don't measure up in some way. Now, those who are in power, those who are in positions of authority, those who have a great deal of financial wealth in this world, are often opposed to the way of Jesus because the way of love, the way of dignity, always shines light on the corruption and the greed that exists in the economic and political systems of the day. The way of love and dignity demands that anyone who works, the workers deserve to be paid fair and equitable wages. The way of love and dignity, it demands that government provides for and cares for the poor, the widow, and the most vulnerable in our midst. When Jesus came along, proclaiming the way of love and dignity for all, many people started to grumble and they started to whisper amongst themselves and complain. They were like, look at this guy. Check out this guy. He eats with sinners and tax collectors. He even touches lepers. What is this guy thinking? The economic system of Jesus' day was pretty much the same as our economic system is today. It's structured in such a way that the rich get richer, the poor get poorer, and taxes simply went up to prop up the Roman Empire and further perpetuate the oppression of the poor and the vulnerable. And the religious institution of the day, it also functioned in a way that often discriminated and excluded so many people from feeling welcome. The institution of Jesus' day, it was centered around determining who was clean and who was unclean. It excluded certain kinds of people and it labeled them. As a result, Jesus and his way of love and his way of dignity for all, it was met with all kinds of opposition. His message of love was faced with so much hostility. And ultimately, we know how this story goes. We know that ultimately his efforts to show and to extend love and compassion and to welcome and care for and to include and to respect the dignity of every human being, well, eventually it cost him his life on the cross. And so today's gospel, it offers a reminder for us. It offers a reminder for us that if we are going to be the hands and the feet of Jesus Christ in the world today, that we can expect to be hated by the world. That we can expect to be met with opposition and to even face persecution for proclaiming this way of love and dignity for all. But we have to be honest, too. We are not likely in our North American society. We are not likely to be faced with the kind of hatred and the kind of persecution that Jesus and his disciples were faced with. But that doesn't mean we don't face hostility to the way of Jesus. Because indifference itself can be a form of hostility. If the world around us so often feels indifferent to the gospel message of love and dignity, that itself can be a form of hostility. Now, John in his gospel, he makes all of this seem so black and white. He talks about, throughout the gospel, he talks about how there is light and there's darkness. He talks about how there is the truth and there is falsehood. He talks about how there is love and there is hate. And that dualism that John likes to use throughout his gospel, that can lead us to think that we ourselves are either one or we are the other. But the reality is that real life is so often so much more complicated than that. Today's gospel, it draws a sharp contrast. There's the way of Jesus, and then there's the way of the world. And that can leave us thinking that we are either one or the other. So that since we're sitting here in the pew of a church on a Sunday morning, that we must be this one and not the other. But the reality is that sometimes we are both. Remember that John is using the word the world. He's using that to refer to any person or any structure or any system that is opposed to or objects or stands in the way of love and dignity for all people. A love that's made known in Jesus. Sometimes the way of the world is very much alive and present in the life of the church. The church is made up of a group of people who have said yes to being followers of Jesus, and yet sometimes the way of the world, sometimes our choices and our actions, and the way we treat one another, shows that the way of the world, that sometimes our actions and our words, we stand in opposition to love and dignity for all. The article in which I discovered the welcome that I used last week, that if you were here, during the announcements I shared a word of welcome that I think we should adopt as our mantra and our general welcome to all people who come here on a Sunday morning. The article in which I discovered that word of welcome, I think it speaks to what I'm talking about, and I want to share some of it with you. And so it starts off talking about those gay boys. Those gay boys, they sit front and center when they come to church. And sometimes they even hold hands. Some folks have said that the pastor should do something about that. But the pastor tells me he doesn't know what to say. And then there's the man who sneaks in the back door fresh off the street. After the service, he comes in after the service has started, and he leaves before communion is even given. Some of the people sitting nearby him, they start to complain about how bad he smells. How he smells of beer and smoke and sweat. And they say, you know what? The pastor should really do something about that. But the pastor tells me he does not know what to say. What do I say? And then there's that young single mom. She comes in with her 4 children. She's wearing dirty clothes. When the service is on, she lets her kids run around the sanctuary during worship. And then after the church service is over, she stands there and watches her kids eating all the donuts and the watered-down juice. Some say they are so disruptive. Others say they are so distracting. Others say they're eating like little pigs. It's like they haven't eaten in weeks. And some say, you know what, this is not right. Something must be done. But the pastor tells me he doesn't know what to say. And then there's that woman. You know the kind. There's that woman sitting among the faithful. And everybody knows her. She sits there with her painted up face and her cheap perfume and a broken heart. And those who sit close, well, they all treat her for what they think she is. And at the last staff meeting, her name came up. And someone said, something must be done about her. But the pastor tells me he doesn't know what to say. Now, the pastor is a good man. The pastor he tries to be holy, and he tries to be just, and he wants to do the right and the loving thing. And he wants to look like Jesus. And he asks me if I have any thoughts on anything he could say. And the author of this article says, "Yes, sweet pastor, I do." The author said, "Start with this and say it louder and more clearly than any other words you speak. Welcome to this church. This is a place of love and hope. This is a place of safety and forgiveness. We will be food for the hungry here. We are living water for all those who thirst here. We are so glad that you have come. You are invited. You are loved. Come on in." Say that. Say that to the called and the called out, to the leaders and the greeters, to the dirty and the clean, to the rich and the poor, because we are all the same. We are all deserving of love and dignity. Today's gospel develops a sharp contrast between the way of Jesus, with his good news of love and dignity for all, and the way of the world. But this does not mean that it all comes down to a simple contrast between good and bad people. Because goodness and brokenness live within the church as well as beyond the church. And the way of Jesus and the way of the world live within each one of us as well. And we must always ask ourselves, which way am I going to seek to follow today? So today we celebrate St. Jude's Day. St. Jude is the patron saint for all those who are shunned by the world, and for all who have come to believe that they are lost causes. St. Jude is the patron saint, I think, for all those who find themselves in a situation, no matter what it might be, who find themselves in a situation in life where they think everything is completely hopeless, that there's no way out. And there are so many people right now living in our world and living even in this community of London, who I think are desperate to hear a word of hope and a message of love and life. And I give thanks to God that in this place we seek to say yes to the way of Jesus. That we are a people brought together, united as one in the waters of baptism, and we are committed around a common cause, a common purpose, which is to bring good news to the poor, recovery of sight to the blind, release to the captives, to let the oppressed go free, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor for absolutely everyone. I give thanks that we want this to be a place where no matter who it is that walks through these doors, that they experience that love of Jesus Christ. Are we perfect at doing that? Absolutely not. Sometimes the influence of the world creep in, and we fall short of respecting the dignity of our brothers and sisters. Sometimes that happens by our choices, our words, our actions. But this is why confession is a part of our worship each week. It is why at our baptism, when we first said yes to the way of Jesus, to the way of love, it is why at our baptism that we promise that whenever we sin, Not if we sin, but whenever we sin, we will repent and we will return to the way of Jesus. We must not become discouraged by the indifference to the way of Jesus that we often experience in our society, because in the end, this is God's world, and our faithfulness to the way of Jesus will help transform this broken world and bend it toward the kingdom of heaven.